Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Retry Evolved. Today we're looking back at one of the all-time greats, Centipede, released in the arcades in 1980 by Atari. As always, Retry is a second look at retro games, but with Evolved, I go a step further and compare the original arcade version to a bunch of the home console releases over the years. Centipede was created by the Atari tag team of Ed Logg, who either designed or co-designed Asteroids, the Centipede series, Gauntlet, and even the San Francisco Rush series, and his partner, Donna Bailey, who was one of the first woman game creators and programmers in the industry. The arcade cabinet featured a trackball which you would use to control the hero, while then shooting your lasers up through the mushroom forest. Beating the game's namesake Centipede is what advances you to the next level. But you have jumping spiders to dodge as well, and fleas that drop from the top of the screen, leaving more mushrooms in their wake. Now let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of Centipede. It was released in 1982, 2 years after the debut of Centipede in the arcades. What you're listening to now is the sound from the 2600, and it's actually reasonably close to the arcade version of the game. And even though the Atari 2600 had to deal with the aspect ratio for TVs, I have to say that the actual gameplay speed is very comparable to the arcade version. But there's really no way around it. The graphics here on the 2600 version of Centipede are horrendous. The mushrooms are completely unrecognizable in comparison to the arcade version of the game. This actually presents a pretty serious problem when it takes multiple hits to destroy a mushroom, and in the Atari 2600 version of Centipede, you have no way of knowing how many more shots it will take to get rid of what's in front of you. It's time to jump ahead 5 years to 1987 and look at Centipede on the Atari 7800, also released by Atari. As you can hear, the 7800 sound from Centipede, even though it was different from the 2600 in the arcade version just a little bit, it's actually pretty good. It captures the spirit of the game, and it sounds right. It's pretty much what you'd expect. As you can see, moving the game to an 8-bit system like the Atari 7800 greatly improved the graphics. All the enemies are easily recognizable, and you can easily see your shot damage on the mushrooms. If you've got an Atari 7800, I highly recommend picking up Centipede. It's one of the best console releases of the game, and you know what? The 2600 version isn't really that bad. Even though it's graphically limited, it's still reasonably fun to play. There was another version of Centipede released in between these two versions of the game for the Atari 5200. There's even a trackball accessory you can track down on eBay for the 5200 version of Centipede if you want to play it just like you did in the arcades. One slight problem though, actually finding a trackball controller for the 5200 that works? Good luck. One quick side note, I actually prefer the joystick to the trackball when playing Centipede. It's a lot easier to control. All the different versions of the game that you've seen so far feature 1 or 2 players, but it's not 2 players at the same time, it's 2 players alternating turns. That was pretty common for arcade games in the early 80s. It wasn't until games like Joust became successful that arcade owners realized that cooperative play games made them twice as much money. Now we're going to jump 5 more years into the future to 1992 and take a look at Centipede on the original Game Boy made by Accolade. Hey, I told you that the Atari 2600 version wasn't so bad. This proves it. Now I know that the original Game Boy hardware is limiting, but seriously, they had 10 years from the release of the Atari 2600 version and 12 years since the arcade version, and this is what you get. The graphics are decent, but that is the only thing that Game Boy has going for it. The sound is worse. The gameplay is atrocious. It feels like you're playing in slow motion. When you think of Centipede, you think of enemies flying down the screen at you and frenzied fast-paced action. Not this. Accolade Majesco also released a Game Boy Color version of Centipede 6 years later in 1998. Clearly, this Game Boy Color game was just released to make a quick buck. There's no improvement to the sound, which you can hear. There's no improvement to the graphics, the gameplay. They just added some pastel colors. Really? After 6 years? I mean, this is 1998 at this point. The Super Nintendo has been out for ages. Let's compare the Game Boy Color version, which came out in 1998, with the Sega Game Gear version that came out in 1996. Now, like the Game Boy versions of the game that were released by Accolade and not Atari, the Sega Game Gear version of the game, which you're listening to now, was also not made by Atari, it was made by Sega. It was released as part of the Arcade Classic series, which also included Pong and Missile Command. I guess the sound's okay, but the graphics kind of flicker and they're a little jumpy, and the gameplay is so slow. It's like the handheld versions of Centipede completely got away from what this game was originally about. Fortunately, the Sega Genesis version of Arcade Classics with Centipede, Pong, and Missile Command was not plagued with the same problems that the Game Gear version was. The sound and graphics on the Sega Genesis version are extremely similar to the Game Gear version, and it should be. They both came out in the same year and were co-developed together in 1996. The immediate difference you will see, though, is that the Sega Genesis version actually plays like the arcade version of Centipede. It's got the faster gameplay, no flickering, you can shoot the mushrooms and they actually visually show damage. It's all the things you'd expect from a good arcade port of the game. My only complaint is something I can't show you, and it's that when you play it, it feels a little sluggish, like there's a delay in the controls. The year is now 1997, and we're going to compare the Super Nintendo version on the left with the Sega Genesis version of Centipede on the right. Awesome gameplay, pretty much perfect graphics, and the sound, it's a little off, but not so bad that it would discourage you from playing it. Centipede was released on the Super Nintendo as part of the Midway Presents Arcade's Greatest Hits the Atari collection. This version of Centipede was made by Midway, and they did a really good job porting the original arcade classic. It's always interesting to see Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis games side by side, especially a game like this, which they came out only a year apart. The sound is a wash in between the systems, the graphics are clearly better on the Super Nintendo version of Centipede, and you know what? The gameplay is better on the Super Nintendo version as well. There's none of that delay that I mentioned earlier that I felt while playing the Sega Genesis version. Interesting bit of trivia, in the Super Nintendo version of Centipede, they included the original high score from the arcade game, 16543. Honestly, I think that's a pretty badass thing to do. It's a great nod to the original arcade game, which came out 17 years before the Super Nintendo version. In 2005, we moved back to the handheld systems and look at Centipede on the Game Boy Advance. It was released on the Game Boy Advance as part of the Centipede Breakout Warlords cartridge released by DSi Games. The Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Sega Game Gear versions of Centipede that I've shown you so far, they're all pretty rough, but they weren't made by Atari, and the Game Boy Advance version of Centipede wasn't made by Atari either. But it really doesn't hurt it. The graphics, the sound, they're all pretty much spot on for Centipede, and my only real criticism is once again similar to the same thing that I criticized with the other handheld versions. The gameplay speed is slow. The Game Boy Advance version of Centipede is pretty much Centipede on easy mode. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because unlike the Game Boy Color, and Game Gear versions of the game, this version's actually fun to play. For Centipede, the 80s began with a great arcade release that was followed up by home console ports by Atari, where they continually made efforts to improve it and get it as close to the arcade version as possible. Then we get to the 90s, where other companies were less interested in making a good arcade port and more interested in rushing the title out for quick sales. As the 90s came to a close, we saw developers finally taking the subject matter seriously again, and we see the quality of the games continue to improve. Which leads us back to today's version of Centipede. The version on the right is a flash version of Centipede, which is an arcade port from Atari that's featured on their webpage. Centipede back in the hands of its original creator, Atari. As you can expect, it's a pretty good port of the game. The graphics and sound are excellent. The only criticism I have is why is the aspect ratio of the flash version of the game different from the arcade? You could have made it any resolution that you wanted it to be. There's really no excuse for it. And just like the Super Nintendo version, they brought back their homage to the high score of the original arcade. I love that! There are so many more versions of this game out there. I just wanted to give you a glimpse of the arcade and console history of the great game Centipede. Thanks for watching. For VideoGameSaga.com, this has been Tony B asking you, have you evolved?